Hello and welcome to another Mr. Carter Science Special. In this video we'll be looking at the structure of the heart. By the end of this video all of you will be able to describe the structure of the heart and how the heart functions. So we'll start with the classic diagram of the heart. Now there's a large number of structures that you need to be able to identify and name, and I'll try and help you with those. We'll begin by identifying the left and the right of the heart. You need to put yourself in the position of a doctor or a surgeon who's looking at the patient, and you are looking at the patient's heart, so everything is back to front. So the left hand side of the heart is over here and the right hand side of the heart is over here, the opposite way round, because it's the patient's heart that you are looking at. You'll notice that the right hand side of the heart is coloured blue, and that's to denote that the right hand side of the heart is carrying deoxygenated blood. And the left hand side of the heart is coloured in red, and that's to show that the left hand side is carrying oxygenated blood. Now if you can remember that, then that gives us a great place to start and to think about. So if we start and begin with the left hand side of the heart, and we think about the fact it's carrying oxygenated blood, and we identify next the valves, and I'm colouring those in black here. And you can see these valves here because they form an arrow. We can turn them into an arrow, and if you know that the blood is oxygenated on the left hand side, then that blood must have just come from the lungs, and the science word for lungs is pulmonary, and we should remember that a vein is always going into the heart, so that should be quite easy for us to identify. Here we have the pulmonary vein going into the heart. The next word to think about is atrium. Atrium, and I'll show you here the left atrium. Atrium means entrance, so many buildings will have an atrium as you enter them, many office buildings in particular, as well as religious buildings. So we have the left atrium, and the left atrium is separated from the left ventricle by a valve. Sometimes these are known as AV valves, and that's because they are atrioventricular valves between the atrium and the ventricle. So now if I clear that away and show you now, identify for you here, again colouring it in black, what we have here is the ventricle. And one of the ways you can remember it's a ventricle is if you look at the bottom, the very bottom here, we can almost draw the letter V, V for ventricle. Now of course the left ventricle is carrying oxygenated blood because it's come from the lungs, and if we look at the next set of valves in the heart, which are up here, then again we can make that arrow and we can see that the blood is then flowing out of the heart, and it's carrying oxygen, so that blood must be flowing to the body so that all the body cells can use that oxygen in respiration. And it's also carrying the blood away from the heart. So any blood vessel that's carrying the blood away from the heart is an artery, and the biggest artery in your body is the aorta. So we can see here that this is the aorta carrying the oxygenated blood out of the left hand side of the heart. We mentioned these little valves down here. These little valves are known as semilunar valves. So we've got two types of valves in the heart. We've got the AV valves and we've got semilunar valves. If we look at the right hand side of the heart, largely we've got exactly the same things going on. We can look at the right atrium, the entrance at the top here. We can identify the AV valve here, which gives us our arrow to show the blood is flowing in. Now again, blood flowing into a heart must be a vein. In this case it's the largest vein in the body, so it's got a Latin name, the vena cava, and that takes all the blood into the right atrium. The right atrium is separated by the AV valve from this chamber of the heart down here, which is the right ventricle. And again, we can remind ourselves that that's a ventricle because we can draw the letter V at the base of the ventricle. As the blood flows through the ventricle, he has to make a turn to go up and out. So if we identify the semilunar valves here, that can turn into an arrow to show us the blood flowing up and out. And again, anytime the blood is flowing away from the heart, that must be an artery. In this case, the pulmonary artery, and it's the only artery in your body that carries deoxygenated blood. It's called the pulmonary artery, so it's carrying that deoxygenated blood towards the lungs. Now, we've mentioned on the previous slide a number of the valves and how useful those valves are for forming arrows to let you know the flow of the blood through the heart. We can again see that flowing up and out through the heart. So we've named those valves here. At the top we have our two semilunar valves which separate the ventricles from the arteries, and then left and right in the separating the atriums from the ventricles, we have the two AV valves, atrioventricular valves. Now if you ever do a heart dissection, you'll notice that on the left hand side of the heart, the AV valve on the left hand side of the heart is actually just made up of two flaps of skin, two valves, so that's known as a bicuspid valve. On the right hand side of the heart, the AV valve, the atrioventricular valve, actually has three flaps of skin there. You can't quite see that on the diagram, and they are known as tricuspid valves. In between the left and the right of the heart, you have an area known as the septum. To separate the two halves of the heart, a septum. You also have one in your nose that separates your left and right nostrils, a septum. Now you've just seen the classic diagram of the heart, but the exam boards currently want you to understand and be able to identify all the structures on a more accurate version of the heart. So if I show you that by looking on the left hand side, which carries the oxygenated blood, and that will flow in here through the pulmonary veins into the left atrium, through the AV valves here and into the ventricle here, and the blood will then be squeezed out when the ventricles contract, and it would go up and out and through the semilunar valve here, leaving through the aorta. Now, one of the things to notice is that aorta actually goes behind the other blood vessel I'll talk about in a minute. The aorta quickly turns to go down to the rest of your body, the organs, etc., your legs that need the oxygenated blood, but also it very quickly splits off into three separate arteries which will carry blood up towards your head and left and right down your left and right arms. If we then fill in the same thing for the right hand side of your heart, you can see here there's actually two blood vessels leading into the atrium, and those are the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava, which both feed into the right atrium. The blood will then flow from the right atrium through the atrioventricular valve before turning and going up and out through the semilunar valve and into the pulmonary artery. Again, arteries are flowing away from the heart, and you can notice here that the pulmonary artery quickly separates into two areas. So you can see that the pulmonary artery actually crosses over the aorta, and that's a little bit more complex to understand, but it is more accurate. I would also pause the video at this point and just see, can you name all the parts in this diagram? There are 11 parts of the heart for you to identify and name. So pause the video now and see what you can remember. So here are the answers. Number 1 is the aorta. Number 2 is the left atrium. Number 3, guarding the entrance to the aorta, is the semilunar valve. Number 4 is the AV valve, the atrioventricular valve. Number 5 is the left ventricle, down here. Number 6 is the right ventricle carrying the deoxygenated blood. Number 7, the right atrium. Number 8 is the other semilunar valve. Number 9 is the pulmonary artery. And if you remember, that splits to go left and right. And number 10 is the vena cava. In this case, the vena cava superior. The inferior is down here. And finally, number 11, carrying the oxygenated blood back from the lungs and into the heart, is the pulmonary vein. Let's see if you can apply your knowledge now and answer this exam question. Pause the video, read carefully and see what answers you come up with. And here are the answers. The human heart pumps blood. The diagram shows a section through the human heart during a heartbeat. Which of these is shown in the diagram? A, closed semilunar valves. Well, let's identify those semilunar valves. There they are, here and here, and they're not touching. That means blood will be able to flow easily through them. In fact, if we follow that blood in here, then this will help us to understand. We can go into the left atrium. Here we go, into the left atrium. And that blood will not be able to flow through here because the AV valves have been shut. The blood that's in the left ventricle cannot flow backwards into the atrium because the AV valve shut, but it can flow up and out through the semilunar valves. And the same is true on the right hand side of the heart. The blood flowing in from the vena cava into the atrium cannot go through the AV valves because they are closed, and the blood that's already in the ventricle here cannot go backwards into the atrium because the AV valve is closed. So the only place is to go up and out of the artery through the semilunar valves. So it can't be this because semilunar valves are not closed. We're not seeing contraction of the atria because the thinnest muscle wall here, this very thin muscle wall, isn't contracting on either atria, on the left or the right. So it's not the contraction of the atria. As we've already mentioned, the atrioventricular valves, the AV valves, are closed, so it can't be that. So the only correct answer is contraction of the ventricles. Here is the correct answer. And you can see that because the muscle walls there are contracting and moving in. And while we're mentioning the muscle walls, the left ventricle has the thickest muscle wall in the heart because it has to send the blood all around the body, the oxygenated blood all around the body, and that means it needs to generate a very, very high pressure. Next thickest, although much thinner, will be the muscle walls in the right ventricle, and they have to create pressure to send the blood to the lungs through the pulmonary artery, but of course the lungs are much closer, so you don't need as much pressure as you need to send the blood around the body. And then the very thinnest walls come from the atriums. Now the atriums only have to send the blood from the atriums into the ventricles, and that's not a very far distance at all. So they have the thinnest walls. Now let's look at part 2. Which chamber in the heart has a thin muscle wall and contains deoxygenated blood? Well, as we've just said, both ventricles have got quite thick muscle walls, so it can't be the right or the left ventricle, even though the left ventricle's got the thickest muscle wall and the right ventricle is slightly thinner. So we have to look at the atriums because the atriums have got the thinnest muscle walls. And the only one that carries deoxygenated blood is the right atrium. So the correct answer is the right atrium. And let's think about that. We've just seen it in the exam question. How do we actually get a heartbeat? Well, the thin muscle walls of the atrium will contract and force blood through the valves, the AV valves, into the ventricles. And then the thick muscle walls of the ventricles will contract and force blood through the valves into the arteries, and the arteries will carry the blood away from the heart and around the body. You can actually hear two sets of valves closing when the heart beats. You get that da-dum sound, da-dum, da-dum. The AV valve and then the semilunar valve. One and the other. Da-dum, da-dum. You can hear the closing of each valve. The AV valve first, the semilunar valve second. I hope you've enjoyed this video about the heart and the heart structure. If you have, don't forget to like and subscribe, and comment below, let me know what you've learnt. Thank you very much for watching.